Hello, Yaker here with another Warframe video, this time in MS Paint. So, I've talked a lot about the beam weapon changes and how I feel like they aren't very good to the more single-target beam weapons. And I thought it might be nice to put forward a suggestion for how I would alter beam weapons to be a little bit less slanted towards like the Atmos and the Amprex, right? Now, so I've got this little diagram drawn up here. This is a little generous to call it call a couple lines of diagram. So consider this a representation of 2 seconds, right? So you got a little line going up to 2 seconds. These go up to 1 second. So with the current beam weapon wind up, right? It starts you at 10% damage and winds you up to 100% damage after 1 second, and it resets each time you change targets, right? So let's say we're targeting 3 enemies here, right? And we target them with like the Synapse or the Flux Rifle or something, right? And so this is going to be, 3 seconds of wind up over the course of 3 enemies, right? And now in the first 0.1 seconds of this, let's pretend we're doing 10% damage. For all I know, it increases 1% at a time perfectly linearly, or it could chunk up in a different amount of time. But we're going to just say hypothetically, for the first 0.1 seconds, you're doing 10% of damage. Maybe it's 20% of damage for the first 0.1 seconds, or 15% average, or whatever, but it doesn't really matter exactly what it is. So my suggestion would be to increase the ramp up to 2 seconds and make it per clip. So fairly simple suggestion. And the reason I think this would be a better workaround is because it's more common to fire at a bunch of enemies in a single clip with like the Synapse or other weapons, but with the Amprex, to clear the same number of enemies, you only need to fire at maybe 2 or 3 targets, when the Synapse might have to fire at 8 targets one at a time, right? So let's say we have this hypothetical scenario where the Amprex could do this with just 2 targets, and the third guy dies to AoE, right? Amprex has just got this little area here. Okay, bing. It's terrible, but yeah, I think you get the idea. So the Amprex suffers for 2 seconds of windup and 200 milliseconds of doing the crappiest, chunk of damage. And the Synapse suffers from 3 seconds of windup and 300 milliseconds of doing the crappiest chunk of damage. So I think the thing here is that this would buff both of these weapons a little bit, but it would buff the Synapse a lot if we made the windup 2 seconds per clip, right? Because also you have this area. This is probably about. It's actually not going to be like 100 milliseconds. It's probably be multiplied. This is like 200 milliseconds, right? Where you're doing the whatchamacallit, that low damage chunk, right? So I guess this diagram doesn't work at all, but it's just for demonstration purposes. So the idea would be that in this long windup, it would equalize weapons a little bit more, right? Because chaining weapons like the Amprex and the Atmos, right, can kill 5 enemies, 10 enemies while only targeting 2 or 3, right? Whereas the Synapse, you do have to actually get that targeting penalty for each and every enemy you target, right? So you can't get the full benefit unless you actually target them all individually, meaning you also get the full amount of penalties. Yeah, anyway. So those 2 weapons are particularly good post-patch, especially post-nerf, because the nerf hasn't affected them as much. And the thing is that before the nerf, they were probably the 2 best beam weapons coming out of it anyway. The Amprex like bordering on overpowered because of how much damage it can do to such a large crowd. And they're still really good. And I think that we deserve a change that is more in line with penalizing those weapons, or at least penalizing those weapons the same amount as other weapons are penalized. And the way this ends up working out is I think that this change would penalize the Amprex and the Atmos about as much as they are currently. Maybe it would make them the minuscule amount better, I don't know, 5% better or something. But it would make weapons like the Synapse probably like 25 or 30% better than they are currently. And it would make them better at the actual like meta that the entire game has of fighting hordes of enemies, right? And I think that's pretty much just like covers the whole thing. Like just have a long wind up. And you might say like, oh, 2 seconds though. That's so fucking long, man. But it's gonna be much shorter than what you currently have to deal with any single target weapon. And frankly, at 0.8 seconds, some of the single target weapons were probably overperforming. And we definitely also needed some kind of additional nerf for the multi-target weapons, right? So I think 2 seconds would work out pretty well, possibly with like an asterisk exception for the battery-based beam weapons. It might be too long for them, right? So maybe there are certain beam weapons that should have their own separate, shorter windup of 1 second or something, right? It makes it a little bit inconsistent, but you know, you've got these weapons with such different firing characteristics. I don't think you can just apply a blanket effect like this to all of them at the same value and have it work out very well. Okay, it's not going to happen probably. So yeah, I think this is pretty much the whole suggestion here. Have the windup happen over 2 seconds, have it decay over 2 seconds as well, and take 2 seconds to decay. This also would mean that retargeting is more forgiving. Stopping firing for a second and starting again is going to be isn't going to be such a bad DPS decrease. So there are some advantages to the 2 second windup once you've gotten it up there, right? It's more forgiving, more what's the word I'm looking for here? It's more of a smooth effect, right? It's going to be less harsh if you just like stop firing for a second and start firing again, right? Anyway, and 2 seconds may not seem like a lot, but it is fairly long in shooters, you know, more than you might think. So yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing. That's what I would do if I had my way with beam weapons, or something very similar to it. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly 2 seconds. It doesn't have to apply to every single weapon evenly, but you know, I think just a longer windup that is not per enemy. I'm really not a fan of the per enemy thing because of how it differently affects multi-target weapons and single target weapons, right? Yakri out.